and I drive the car that won that war as well. And I think what they started out with was what we took for granted. What they started their lives out with was what we took for granted. And we were a pain in the ass. That's it.
How did you feel when you sold your first story like that? And you must have been aware that every other writer in the business hated you.
Well, that's not why.
I went to this convention, okay? Oh geez, after I wrote my second or third story, and nobody was talking to me. Nobody knew me. So I got this cigar, and I sat in this convention. Everywhere I went, I would smoke this cigar. And at some point, Marv Wolfman turns around and looks at me, and he says, you know, you better move or breathe or something, or we're going to throw some dirt on you. I don't think everybody hated me until they met me.
Yes, we did.
Had you tried to write anything in comic book form before that story?
In comic book form?
Yeah, I mean, that was the first thing you sent to DC, but it's the first time you ever wrote anything in comic book form?
Yeah. I had written plot ideas, but it was the first. You know, I wrote it by drawing the panels and writing the scene descriptions and dialogue in the little boxes, I think, which nobody followed, but that was fun. I didn't know how to do it, so I sent it in anyway.
All right. Steve, what do you consider your first real professional work?
Well, that's tricky because the first thing I ever did, excuse the voice, too much talking. I met Mark every year, over here, back in 1971, and he said, let's do a story. So the first thing we did was a story for a comic called High Adventure. This was in 1972. But I sort of count my real starting in comics in 1975 when I started working at Marvel, inking Warlock. So,
and who have you worked with who just couldn't believe you were working with that person? Inking somebody else or working with a writer or something of that sort?
well, as we were saying, that we were the first generation that got into comics who had been fans of comics rather than just needing Mark and they knew how to draw it, so that, you know, comics was like the last resort. So what I liked about being an inker was that I got to ink everyone that I always admired, Jack Kirby and Gil Kane and Carmine Infantino. I used to tell the editors, let me ink any pencil over 50, because that was the age at the time that all of the older artists were. So that's pretty much how it went.
And when you started inking comics like that and drawing them, did you plan to do it for a short time, or did you say, I'll do this the rest of my life? Did you have any career goal?
I must admit, I had no career goal other than to keep at it as long as it was fun. And it still is, actually. Plus, I also draw my own stuff, too.
Yes.
Eventually, I got good enough so I could draw my own stuff. But I still enjoy inking and working with other people.
Good. Well, what was your first professional job? Was a Gold Key story, I believe?
Well, actually, it was, I had a checkered start. I was a science fiction fan rather than comics fan when I started. I mean, I wasn't as much comic fan than in '72. But I've been a science fiction fan. A friend of mine, Jay Haldeman II, sold this science fiction story to Ted White at Amazing and Fantastic. I did a little black and white illustration went along with it. I'm not sure it's my first professional story or job because I don't know that I was ever actually paid the $25 for the drawing, or it might have been $10. No check ever showed up, and the artwork didn't come back either. So, but that was in a quote professional magazine. Good lesson. My first action story. Len and I disagree on how what action this script was, which is okay because Len's wrong and I'm not. So that's all right. But basically. When I wanted to get into comics in '72, I had been to art school. I had done a project for 2 years, a comic that I had written, penciled, inked, and lettered called The Star Slammers, was science fiction. I didn't know anything about comics at the time. I knew very little. I hadn't gone to conventions really. I didn't know professionals. I hadn't seen much original work. I didn't understand, because I was very green, that showing a science fiction story to an editor was not going to get me a Spider-Man job. You learn this stuff as you go along. But I went to DC because in 1972, to me, DC was doing the most interesting work in mainstream comics. Marvel was kind of doing repetitive, what I thought was repetitive stuff. DC was trying a lot of stuff, some of it a few years earlier, like Enemy Ace, and then Enemy Angel, the Eight, the Creeper. A lot of it didn't last very long, but it was really interesting. So I went there on a complete fluke. I ended up in Comment Tino's office. I did not have an appointment to go see him. And he looked at my work. We had a 10-minute conversation in which I remember nothing, except that he asked me if I had been influenced by Bernie Krigstein, which I had not at that time. I didn't know Krigstein's work. I see it now. I see the linear quality, the design quality. And Carmen liked it enough that he called in 3 of his editors, including one of them who turned me down about 20 minutes earlier, and made them all give me a short story to draw in the back. Because back then there were short stories in magazines. You could still do a short story in the back of Star Spangled War or whatever it was. So a lot of us got our starts in little stories that were in the backs of things where you could learn your craft, make enough money to stay alive and get better. So one of those editors was Joe Orlando. Len will give his side of the story in a minute. I will say it's wrong. But as I remember, Joe handed me a story called Cyrano's Army by Len Weed, whose work I knew. And he said, this was an inventory story, it's in my drawer, it's due tomorrow. So it ended up being, what's that? What was that, about an 8-page story?
Yeah,
6 or 8, something like
6
that.
or 8.
6 or 8. And I don't know if it's really due tomorrow, Joe just said that to get me off the schneid. But that was my first printed story in comics, was Weird War. Weird War number 10 was that story. So that's how I got started.
Tell me somebody you worked with, you were very impressed.
You know, I've had an amazing amount of luck working with people, and this is not from the beginning of my career, but I'm going to bring them in anyway because it was really fun, which is I got to work with John Buscema drawing the Avengers. Tom Hammer was inking it. I had a lot of editorial bumps, that was nothing to do with them, but just Tom Hammer and John Buscema, the Avengers, it doesn't get much better than that as far as I'm concerned. I will say by that time, John was mostly asleep when he was doing his layouts. But asleep, John was still better than 98% of the guys doing stuff when they were awake. His storytelling was always smooth. I don't know if this is true, Mark might know, but what I was told, when I do a story, I have to build thumbnails and lay everything out and get everything lined up for 20 pages or whatever I'm doing. I'm told that John took the script, started drawing on page 1, and he finished up on page 20 or 22 with everything on about 5 or 6 panel pages, everything lined up perfectly, and no crammed panels to try and squeeze in the last of the story.
Yeah.
He was just a masterful storyteller.
Yes.
And the movement from panel to panel, both the eye movement and the storytelling movement, his decision of what moments to show was just astounding. So getting to work with him was just a complete delight, whether he was asleep or not.
And when you got into comics, did you want to stay in comics for a while, or did you have another career goal?
I didn't at the time. I don't know if there's anybody else's experience here. I know that Chayka and I and some other friends of mine had this discussion, maybe some of you as well, I don't remember that, but we had a discussion. None of us thought that comics was going to be around in 10 years. I got it in 1972. There was no direct market. Every time we saw sales figures, which they used to release every so often, we would see sales figures, they were down from the previous month. Comics were kind of a downward trend, and we could all see that sooner or later they were going to be toast. But we all loved comics. Nobody I knew got into comics for the money. Everybody, it wasn't that much even then. Everybody got into it because they loved telling stories, they loved drawing, they loved writing, whatever it was. We just loved the medium. We wanted to do it, and we wanted to do it while it still existed. So I didn't have a lot of long-range career goals, and I did tell Neil Adams once, which he reminds me of every time I see him practically, that I told him that I thought, well, I'll be in comics maybe 4 or 5 years tops. But I thought by that time I would know everything there was to know about comics, and I'd have to go off and get some real job. I also thought comics were going to be gone by then. None of those things turned out to be true, so I was not very good at prognosticating. But again, I'd have to get a real job. But really, I didn't have plans at the time because we just wanted to do it while it was there. And then I thought, well, when it's done, then I'll go find something else to do.
Louise, what did you consider your first professional work?
Oh, it was probably editing at Warren.
How did you get in there?
I was working in advertising promotion for a magazine company, and I learned to do paste-ups and mechanicals and stuff as part of my job. And one of my friends who worked at Warren said, "There's an opening over there and it pays better than your job." And I said,
Was the opening editor or was
the opening was in the production department. I went in, I applied, Bill DeBay was the editor, and I applied, and I got the job right away. I was later told by somebody that it was because I reminded Bill DeBay of his first wife, who he still was enamored of, even though they had been divorced for a number of years. I don't know if that's true. I sort of hope it is, because, you know,
I'm willing to bet it is.
it's a great story. Anyway, so you usually, I guess you use what you got. Yeah, sometimes you get lucky. DeBay never made any moves on me or anything. I want you to know he was a perfect gentleman at all times, and this was only told to me like 30 years later, so, you know, God knows. I was not that great at comic book production, but it turned out Warren was a very small company, and they always needed people to do things. And they would say, "We need some advertising copy written. Does anybody want to write advertising copy?" I'd say, me. Letters, me, I won't do letters pages. And eventually they said, "Oh, get her out of production, please get her out of production," and move her into editorial. So they created an editorial position for me. And then eventually when DeBay quit, and I became the editor of the line.
And before you went to work for Warren, how many comic books had you read?
Oh, not as many as a lot of you guys. I had read comics when I was a kid, and I had read the Warren comics. I mean, I thought Archie Goodwin was a genius. So the fact that I should, particularly those early Warren comics, when Archie was he was in control and writing everything, so that when I had the opportunity to work there and actually sit in the chair that Archie Goodwin had sat in, I was thrilled beyond belief.
Did you ever, because Archie wrote some scripts for you over the years, right? Didn't
Did he?
he? You were a couple.
I don't.
I'm trying to get.
I don't think he did.
Really? Okay.
But I did find a script. Now, I had no training in editing anything, right? But I did find one of the old scripts that Archie had edited in a drawer. He had changed everything about the script. He had changed the time in which the story took place, some of the places, rewritten the dialogue. I mean, he just rewrote the whole thing. I said, "Oh, wow, I guess this is how people edit." So then for a while I tried that, and I'm sure it would have made me very beloved of the people who worked with me. But eventually I came to my own way of thinking, which is the same thing Archie had come to, after he had done this particular script, I guess, because we discussed it at one point.
Was your commitment to comics at that point so that if somebody had offered you a non-comic book job for $10, $20 a week more, you would jump? No, never. Once you're hooked, it's like heroin. I just loved it. I loved everything about it. I loved the people. I loved the freedom that I had, the freedom I had to be creative, and the people I worked with, and the artists and the writers. I loved everything about it. You couldn't have paid me to get off of that job if I had, I just loved it. I married Walter, that's right. I married Walter because he reminded me of John Severin, whom I was in love with. Was it his inking style or himself?
It was his very self. It was his gentlemanly, clever, funny, humorous humanity. There you go.
Wow.
Just like John Severin. Okay. I love John Severin.
Anthony, what do you consider your first professional work?
Well, my first job was as Bill DeBay's assistant editor at Warren for a while, and then I went over to Marvel and was doing production on the Marvel black and white, on the British black and whites, doing zip-a-tone work and paste up and such on the horror black and white titles. And very strange, because I later made my reputation as a colorist, and I worked almost exclusively in black and white comics when I started out. But I had, like Walter had said, we did not expect comics to last a long time. And the predictions were very much doom and gloom about how close DC was about to going all reprint or whatever. And I was in Minnesota, and I loved comics, and I was majoring in architecture, and I decided I'd saved up $1,000, I moved to New York, I expected to starve, but I wanted to see if I could get into comics and work there a couple of years until the comic business ended, and then I'd go back to school and go for a real career.
Did you have a job description in mind when you moved there?
Well, I was really hoping on editorial. I came from, my father was an Associated Press editor, my grandparents were newspaper publishers and editors. But I just moved, I also had samples. I wanted to be a penciler, but I got in, I was not happy at Marvel, because at that time, most of the people working for Marvel had only been in the business a couple of years. You had, a lot of people who, because Marvel had been so small in the 60s, that you had a lot of people, assistant editors, assistant production managers, etc., who'd been in the business a year or so. And I really wanted a teacher. I wanted mentors. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to be at DC, where you could learn from people like Julie Schwartz and Jack Adler and Saul Harrison. I mean, Julie Schwartz and Jack Adler did the separations on Action Comics #1. And there was this connection. And Saul Harrison had this Junior Woodchucks program, which was, Saul was aware that they were all in their late 50s at that time, or about 5 or 7 years younger than I am now. But it was one of the things for all of us is we were so clearly the young ones, because there'd been no one new in the business in 20 years, outside of, Denny and Neil Adams and Steranko and Roy Thomas. And Nelson Bridwell, too. There's no one in comics outside of those people who are now like 72 years old or something. You can find 80 and 90-year-old former professionals, and you can find 65 on down, but we've skipped a generation or more. And DC had this new talent program, and it was just a really exciting time to be in the business, because there were all of us. I lived on the 4th floor with Jerry Boudreau in the building that Walt Simonson lived in Brooklyn in '73. And we partied together, because we knew no one else. It was a lot like the Parisian literary circles of the 20s, because there were all these people, and we were pretty cohesive as a group. And we were very clearly the young ones, which is why it was very scary for me 3 years ago when the New York Times, a reporter on Comic-Con, identified me as one of the aging graybeards of the comic industry. But for me, I was thrilled to work. I was thrilled to work with Jack Adler. I was thrilled to work with Julie Schwartz, especially. But I guess the #1 person for the 70s, I mean, in later years, I got to write scripts that Walter Cronkite narrated and such, but in the 70s, not in comics specifically, but I got to co-author the Shadow scrapbook with the creator of the Shadow, Walter Gibson. And I was a huge Shadow fan, and just to be the one person he selected to write the book with him and put the book together was just magical for me.
Great. Len?
Yes.
Your turn. I want to ask you, most people have heard, I think, how you got into comics.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about, let's ask you some different questions here.
All right.
All right? When you got into comics, they were treating you and Marv, you were largely teamed at that time,
Yeah, briefly.
as the new kids get lost. You weren't treated that wonderfully at first, and you had a couple of run-ins where they wanted to kick you out of the company forever and
Yes.
such things like that. At what point did you feel you were in comics to stay?
The day I got blackballed at DC and was told I couldn't work there anymore, and said, well, screw this, and went down the block to Gold Key Comics. I realized I'm in this business. Marv left the industry, became an art teacher for 6 months or a year, however long we were blackballed over at DC.
What year was this?
70, 71, something that early, I think.
All right.
And I went down the block because I was in comics and I wanted to find a job in comics. And I went to the next available company. And then I went to Marvel and started doing a little freelance for them. But unlike everybody else, I never believed comics were going to die. I loved them. They couldn't possibly die if I loved them. And then I had this conversation one day with with Howard. And Howard, I said, comics are here to stay. And Howard looked at me and said, really, how's your buggy whip stop doing these days? And I went, I don't care what you're saying. Comics are an American art form. They're going to be around one way or another forever.
Well, your argument was largely emotional.
Yes.
His was looking at sales figures.
Well, what's that got to do with anything?
Well, I think...
I was right, wasn't I?
There are a lot of people who've lost everything they own taking emotional arguments about things instead of looking at the pragmatic business deal.
Yes, but I'm accidentally absurdly lucky, so
All right. Did you...
I did want to add that when, was DC at 9 and 9 when you were blackballed?
Yes, I think it was.
I didn't want to say, when Len said he went down the block to Gold Key, they were, in fact, at that time, literally down the block. They're actually not 2 blocks. But
DC was at 909 3rd Avenue, and Western Publishing was at 850 3rd Avenue.
Right.
So he did literally go down the block.
I made an appointment to meet Wally Green, who was the editor-in-chief there, a lovely man, and his assistant Paul Kewen. And they looked at me when I came in. They had no idea how old I was. I was the oldest thing by 30 years that was walking through their doors those days. And they said, hi, why are you here? And I said, well, I would like to write comic books for you. And they said, in God's name, why? That was their response, literally. But I said, because I like your books. And you know, I didn't like them as much as DC or Marvel, but I certainly would not have been embarrassed to work, and wasn't. And they loved me. They took me in, I started writing all their top books. I started designing covers, doing all kinds of things.
You weren't writing their top books because I was writing their top books.
You were writing the top funny books. I was writing the top, oh God, these are so serious books.
Star Trek.
Yes, Star Trek and Twilight Zone, which was one of the joys of my life, and a bunch of things. And I kept adding artists to their roster.
Did you ever realize that at the time you were doing stuff for Gold Key, these are the Gold Key books, their ghost comics were hosted by actual dead people.
Wow,
Rod
no, that's
Serling
crazy.
is dead, and Boris Karloff is dead. They actually had dead people hosting.
Thanks. No, I'm not sleeping tonight. I appreciate that. No, my favorite thing, I was writing a book called Mod Wheels for them. This was after I'd been writing a book called Hot Wheels for DC, based on the toys, both based on the toy lines. And I realized that the 2 casts of the 2 books were, with the exception of 2 characters, virtually identical. So I added the 2 characters that were missing from the Gold Key one, and I just continued writing Hot Wheels, essentially. And the first issue came in and was inked by Sal Trapani, and I looked at it and I said, oh, that's great, you've got Jack Abel working for you. And they said, no. I said, what do you mean? This was penciled by Jack, and it was inked by Sal Trapani. They said, no, you do the whole thing. And I said, trust me, I'll tell you what, next week when I come in to deliver my script, I'll bring Jack Abel in to meet you. And they did. I brought Jack in, and they discovered he had been penciling the book, and they hired him on his own, and he started working for Gold Key independently. And then the next issue of Modules came in, and I looked at the art, and I said, oh, you've got Jack Sparling working for you. And they went, oh, never mind, bring him in. And the next day I got a phone call from Sal going, stop it, you're killing me!
There were a number of guys in comics, and I don't think this exists anymore, who if they got a job would just hire somebody to ghost, at least the pencils for them. Sal Trapani may never have actually penciled a single comic that he
I don't think he did.
And same thing was
And he was a nice guy.
And the same thing was
I think
true
he
with
gets
Frank
it.
Giacoia had to pencil something. The same thing was true with Vince Coletta had to pencil something.
Yeah.
They hire out other people to do it.
Mhm.
So you never knew who you were getting. And there was a period when Sal Trapani penciled but did not ink Metamorpho. And we have no idea who penciled those things.
Wow.
I asked Nick Giordano, who was Sal's brother-in-law, and I said, who penciled those? And he said, it wasn't Sal. It might have been me. So So Len, you expected comics to be around indefinitely.
Yes.
You had no logical business reason to think this.
None
You just
whatsoever.
felt that because you wanted them to be around, they would be around for you.
Yes, literally.
Okay. Did you have any career goal in comics that you said, I want to be the head of editor of Marvel, or I want to be the head of DC, or where did you want
I
to
was
go?
hoping to be overlord, actually. I had a hard time with it.
What would have been the ideal job for you within the realm of human
Well,
possibility?
you have to remember, I spent my entire high school and college career studying to be an artist. And I submitted things I had written just to give me something to draw.
And you did draw for Gold Key.
I did. I drew a story for them, and I did a page for the Who's Who in DC.
And Castle Frankenstein.
Anything you want to continue my career, we're going when they saw my sentence, they said, they know it's good, but not ready yet. But we like the writing. Would you like to write for us? And I said, sure. I would have stapled the books if they would have hired me for that. And I became a writer, so I never knew what was going to happen to me next. I mean, I found myself at Marvel by accident. I never meant to go to Marvel. I was writing for DC. My career was starting to burgeon, but I was rooming with Jerry Conway at the time. And Jerry knew I wanted to be at Marvel. And they very insidiously offered me books. I mean, Jerry would come back home to the apartment one day and says, I'm giving up Marvel Team Up. You want to take that over? Interested? I said, Spider-Man, you bet. And I had to give up the Phantom Stranger deal. They would say, I'm dropping Spider-Man. And this went on and on and on until I woke up one morning and discovered I'm working for Marvel Comics. Not for DC anymore, because I'd given them all the DC books to take the Marvel books. And 6 months into it, I got hired as Roy's assistant editor, which I thought was amazing for somebody my age. It was like 23 or 4. And I found out later that Joe Orlando had been pushing Carmine to hire me as an editor. And Carmine said, oh, he's a kid. You give him 10 years to get seasoned, whatever. 6 months after I started as Roy's assistant, Roy left the company and said, you're now the editor-in-chief. I was 25 at the time. I never planned that either. And of course, over at DC, Joe was going to Carmine, schmuck, I told you.
Tell us two things. Tell us one really smart thing you did as the editor-in-chief at Marvel, and one really dumb thing you did as the editor-in-chief.
Oh, the best. One really smart thing was, like most of the guys do what they did best. I've always felt as an editor, I did my job the best when I appeared to be doing it the least, which basically was hire the right people, point them in the right direction, get the hell out of their way. If they start to veer off course, you push them back. But otherwise, let them do what you hired them to do. It's their craft and their art as well. And Sue did that. And the biggest mistake I probably made was hiring Jim Shooter back.
All right.
I know, I'm sorry.
This is a jump ball for anybody on the panel here. I would like to get a little deeper into the question of what was different between, we all worked with guys who were 20 years older than us.
Yes.
What was different between us and them, aside from the fact that we were younger?
Well, we
What
came
was
to work
different?
dressed like this mostly. They were in suits and ties.
Okay, but in terms of approaching the work, in terms of approaching the profession,
Well, as Mark Wolfman,
did any of you ever look at one of those guys and say, oh, I hope I don't wind up like him?
One or two, and I will not name them.
but I mean, as Mark Wolfman has mentioned, we were the first generation who wanted to be in comic books. You know, the earlier generations had wanted, the artists had wanted to be illustrators, had wanted to, you know, be illustrating for slick magazines or even
The newspaper strips.
newspaper strips. And we wanted to do comic books. And that was the biggest thing. I mean, Julie Schwartz was a science fiction writer's agent. You know, because the science fiction pulp market was slowly dying, got into comic books. Mark Weisinger had been editing, and Jack Schiff, Captain Future and the Phantom Detective. As pulps went downhill, they went to where the money was. And they had come from, you know, I think a number of them, you know, really had no great love of comics originally. And would really have preferred originally to have been continuing in magazines, but that wasn't an option. And, we wanted to be doing comic books more than newspaper strips, more than novels, more than, anything else at that time, I think.
Well, now,
You also have to remember the original generation did not have comics to grow up on.
Right.
So, to them, it was always going to be a job.
Their superheroes were in the pulps and on radio and in movies and the newspaper page.
Also, in the 70s, none of us had too many responsibilities. And the older generation had families, and so that we as young people coming in had a lot more freedom to make choices that the older guys didn't. And I think that made a difference also.
in 1973, I was in a situation when essentially I had all the comic book work I could handle. I could have written more, I would have been able to go more. And I made a conscious decision not to be full-time in comics in my life, to explore other things, because I had this guy named Kirby who kept saying to me, don't make comics your whole life, it'll break your heart, it's not. And he wasn't even saying the business was going to end, because he didn't believe the business was going to end, because Jack always believed he would save it. He would reinvent something that
He
would save
actually
it.
did at some point.
Yeah, he was right more often than he had a right to be at that point. But so I didn't get full-time into comics ever. Did any of you ever think to yourself, maybe I should diversify? Did you make a conscious decision? Well, here's an example. Somebody was at, we gave the Bill Finger Award to Robert Kanigher last night, his body of work. And my theory of Mr. Kanigher, who Len, you knew him much better than I did, was that he was always angry at himself because he got into comics in the 40s and he made a ton of money because he was so fast. And he kept thinking to himself, well, I'll do this for another 6 months and then I'll go off and become Ernest Hemingway. I'll go off and do other work. And he couldn't.
Hemingway's a great choice. That's very much what Bob was like.
Yeah, he could not turn down the money. It was difficult for him to say, all right, I'm going to go back to the beginner's part, and I'm going to turn down, next month's Sergeant Rock assignment, and give up that money and get something else. And then by the time I met him, which was in 1970, where I found him in the DC offices yelling at Marv for no visible reason.
Welcome to Monday.
Yeah. That he was just so angry, not only at himself, but at these kids coming in who now were making him, made him an old person in comics. He hated to think of himself as an old person in comics. Did any of you look at some guy who was writing and drawing or drawing comics and say, I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to in 30 years have my life at the mercy of an editor like some of the people these people are dealing with, or a business. Anybody?
I'll take one. I will say one thing about that is that I wouldn't name one person or name anybody, but when I got into comics, I love doing it. I had some incredible luck right at the beginning of my career where I paired up with Archie Goodwin to start Manhunter. I've been in the business about 6 months at the time. I can look at those 7 stories. I can see that my work took a great leap at around the middle of issue, chapter 3, where I suddenly began to figure out inking people and inking in general. But I could also see a number of artists ahead of me in the generation. There was kind of a skip generation, Archie and Denny and a few guys in the middle, but there were older guys who were working. And some of those guys, I could look at their work and you could see that they were doing exactly the same thing that they'd done for 20 or 30 years. They drew women the same way, they drew fashions the same way, they drew cars the same way. And it wasn't the storytelling was bad or the stuff was especially off or anything like that. But it looked like it was all kind of being done by rote. And I just thought at the time, I didn't know to be only in comics maybe 4 or 5 years then, but I didn't want to try to not be one of those guys by the time I'd been in comics for a while. I wanted to try and keep the work as fresh as possible. I got in as an artist in comics without any thought of becoming a writer. I began writing in 78 or 79, so it would have been 6 years after I got into comics. I began writing my own stuff. I wrote all of the fourth job I had writing in comics, the fourth specific job, was I wrote the 3-part adaptation of Raiders of the Lost Ark for John Buscema. And so I was writing from somebody else's script, which was, John was drawing, it was great, it was easy. But I decided that what I would try to do is I would try to write some stuff for artists, I would try to draw some stuff for other writers, and I would try to write and draw some stuff with the hope that each time you came up with a new guy, whether it's a writer or an artist, you have to learn that team up, and you have different strengths in different writers or different artists. You try to figure out how to work with them in some way that's interesting and challenging. And I was hoping that that would keep my own work fresh and prevent me from coming into what I regarded kind of as creative dead ends that I could see in the part of some of the artists, especially artists, not so much the writers. I saw the artists more than that, but at the end of my career, whenever it was going to be.
Steve, when you ink someone like Carmine or Gene Cole or someone like that, did you think of it as just a fun experience, or was it more a learning experience? Could you look at that work and think, inking that man taught me something? Is it something that
Actually, it was that, and what Paul was talking about. Some of these guys, like I got to ink Steve Ditko, and, you know, I still worship his work, but his cars were dated, his clothes were dated, and so I tried to
some of his ideas are dated?
well, yeah, so I tried to nudge the work into a more modern sensibility without, you know, ignoring what the artist intended to do. I mean, my approach as an inker was always try to continue what the penciler had in mind, at least, you know, trying to guess what the penciler might have had in mind. Sort of forgot the question.
No, could you look at your own drawing later and say, oh, I learned that from Carmine, I learned that from
These
Gene?
days, every time I come up with something, I remember the first time I heard somebody mention something that made me think of that. And I was very lucky early on to be hanging around continuity studios with Neil Adams and Dick Giordano, and just being able to watch them at work was better than any art school. Of course, there weren't any art schools for comics at that time, but
Frank Giacoya used to say that inking all these great artists, he inked the greatest artists who ever worked in comics, probably.
yes.
Hurt him as a penciler, because when he would sit down to draw a car, he'd remember how well, you know, Jack Kirby drew a car, and he'd sit down to draw a tree, he'd remember how well, you know, Carmine Infantino drew a tree, and it made him feel like, why bother? Because it's never going to be as good as it was when I worked with those guys. Was it intimidating to you to draw your own after inking so many guys?
Actually, no. I got, for me, it was the other way around. I got to ink John Buscema as well. John, I think technically was the finest artist, just phenomenal. And so it's a great education to me to be able to ink his work and try to absorb some sense of what he was doing. For me, it was very helpful. Gene Cole, it's very lucky number of people I got to work with.
Steve almost inked a story for me on a black bubble that Alex Toten penciled. I literally had this story set up, Toten penciled this, and I used to ask pencilers, give me the names of 3 inkers you want, and I'll get one, who are not under contract at least, and I'll get one of the 3. And Toth wouldn't give me 3 names. He said, I want to see who you get. Get somebody interesting. Get somebody I wouldn't have thought of. So I called Steve, and he was ready to do it. And he actually cleared his schedule. I called DC, it's where the department was, and said, mail it to FedEx it to Steve Laylaw. He's going to start on it. And he didn't come. He called me like 2 days later and said, I never got the job. Where is it? And it turned out that somebody had walked into the DC offices who needed work, and they gave it to him.
It was the aforementioned Frank Giacoya.
Yeah. And
I didn't actually blame him for it, but
no, he didn't know that it was earmarked for you, but they did, you know, I found out after it was too late that Frank was inking it, and he didn't really, he
probably
was,
finished with it by the time he called.
well, it was Frank was near the end of his career. He's a lovely, wonderful man, but they gave it to him because it was a short story. They didn't want to trust him anything longer.
Actually, let me just say, the first time I personally walked into Marvel when I just started, I saw a guy sitting at a table. There was Captain America pencil pages there. He was inking it, and somebody said, "This is Steve. He's new at Marvel." And he looks up and says, "Hi, I'm Jack Kirby." Of course, it was Frank Giacoya. Everyone had a great laugh because clearly he was not Jack Kirby.
Elliot, let's see, quietly through all this. Do you have anything to add about this whole thing I was talking about being exclusive in comics? Did you?
Well, I've had a kind of a ping pong of a career. I mean, I got involved with Atari. When
You just had a
Warner-
pong of a career.
A what?
You just had a pong of a career.
Ponged. story when Warner Communications bought them. And they wanted somebody with a background in education and science fiction, and I was the only one. I was it. I've gone back and forth between writing and teaching and writing and teaching. Actually, a lot of people have, but I got into software, and I just got hooked. So now I can write software in about 9 languages, and it's fun. I mean, it's a game, it's a puzzle. It's like, I checked out of math in high school when they tried to teach me calculus. And, you know, I always thought math was fun. I was always getting hundreds on Regents exams, it was great. Until I did calculus when there weren't answers. Well, in software, it's a logic game and there's still answers. So I've been back and forth among a few different careers, and so I didn't really have a plan. kind of do what comes up.
Here's a question I'm going to throw you out. This is a question I don't think you've never been asked by the panel before, but we got a little time here. Okay? I want to ask you each to tell a brief story about someone you encountered in the comic book business who was not Jack Kirby, John B. Assembly, Gene Colan, Wally Wood, a great, somebody who really impressed you with their skill and ability, who wasn't a superhero, who maybe some of the people in the audience you wouldn't even have heard of or would just know casually from backup features, something like that. Somebody who you were just amazed at their ability. I'll start with a man named Nelson Bridwell, who was one of the most brilliant people I ever encountered in my life. You know, Nelson used to take the reprints from the backs of DC books. He did it from memory. He would someday say to him, "Hey Nelson, we need a backup story that's 9 pages and has something to do with raccoons." And he'd go, "Oh yeah, Batman 14, third story." He would do this. He would do it. And then you could talk to him about Chaucer, and he would quote you pages of the Canterbury Tales. He had this amazing memory, and he was a strange man physically, and he made odd sounds would come out of him. You couldn't figure out which part of his body they were coming from. But he was a very good writer. I think he was a better writer than a lot of people who got more work than he did at the time. And he was just a genuine treasure of that company as a proofreader and as an editorial assistant, a very smart editor. And I don't think he ever got the attention he deserves.
After he died, Julie Schwartz would always say, pretty much every other day, he would say, "Okay, let's ask Nelson." You know, like some reference of some sort. He was the walking encyclopedia. He was. I was sitting in Julie's office one day. This is when Nelson was still alive, obviously, but writing a term paper on Hamlet, and I was in college still. And Nelson comes in and he gives me this whole long explanation of why Hamlet never hesitated. Hamlet was the first modern man, and Shakespeare portrayed him as a guy who thought well, it goes on and on. But it was brilliant stuff. And I said, "You've got to write this down, this is scholarship." He says, "Well, I'm busy writing this book about the ancestry of the superheroes," which he never finished. But it's just, his mind was just falling. It must have been just hell in there.
Okay, somebody tell a story about somebody else.
Okay.
Somebody.
I'll do one. When I was young, and we used to hang out in Continuity. It was Neil Adams and Dick Giano's studio on East 48th Street, just off 5th Avenue. It was kind of the boys' club. There weren't any girls. There were girls there too, but not very often. But basically, it was kind of between Marvel and DC. So a lot of us at that time, no FedEx, no internet. You took your originals, you went into the office, whatever else you're working for, you turned in your work, and then you were done for the afternoon. It was like you'd go over to Continuity and hang out. A lot of us would meet there. It was like a social gathering, and you share a lot of the same interests, so we all knew each other. So I knew most of the guys in my generation in comics. And while I was there, somewhere in the mid-70s, I guess, there was a guy named Ed Davis who came by, who was there. He was a black guy who, I'm pretty sure had sight only in one eye, or had one very weak eye, I can't remember. He was a Vietnam vet. Pretty much to himself, didn't hear much from Ed. I didn't know Ed well. He was an astounding draftsman. He did a picture of the Blackhawks I can still remember that was in its own way as good as the picture of the Blackhawks by Alex Toth. It was different, but it had this grace and character and drawing that was just amazing. He had a few jobs in comics, I don't know what became of Ed. After a while, he wasn't around anymore. But he was also the kind of guy that, maybe I didn't want to get to know too closely. One of the stories about Ed, I don't know if it was true, was that he was riding the New York subway very late at night, had sort of a valise or a briefcase on his lap. And this was a time when maybe riding the late night subway in New York wasn't a really good idea. He was riding, there was nobody else in the car, and a couple of guys got to the station, and he sat across from him, and they began rousting him. They began giving him a hard time, and giving him, obviously not working up to mugging him. And finally one of them got up and went over and sat down next to Ed and began this, hey, giving him crap stuff. Sorry, I'm kidding, kids are here. Giving him stuff. And Ed flipped open the case on his lap, which revealed the pistol, the large pistol and other accoutrement in the case. And the guy got up very slowly, and he walked over next to the other guy. He was still giving Ed stuff. And the other guy, and the guy who went over says, no. And they got up and left at the next stop. So Ed was that kind of guy, whatever that meant. But he was very self-contained, but he was a brilliant draftsman, and that's the part I remember. And he didn't do a lot of work in his career, he didn't have a long career in comics, but I still remember how beautiful his work was, and I have one of his pages.
I remember seeing him up there, and I only remember him ever actually doing one of those Raw Press books.
I don't even know the job my story is from. It's a large tone page. It's a black and white page. It was done in ink wash, and it's really quite lovely.
One person I really liked meeting, and he was just a charming, funny, witty man, was Bob Haney. And Bob Haney, by the way, the humor ran in his family. His nephew is Chevy Chase. But Bob, like his editor, Murray Boltinoff, I don't think got the respect from DC, and especially the younger DC talent. There was a time in about 1973 when for a week or two, Flash was officially assigned to Murray Boltinoff because the book wasn't selling, so Carmine wanted to take it away from Julie Schwartz and give it to Murray because everything Murray edited sold. And I remember one of the younger executives at DC complaining that no matter what they gave to Murray Boltinoff, it sold, and they would start dollar books and they all fail except the two that Murray was editing. And that somehow this was a bad thing, that Murray knew how to sell books to an audience of real readers and kids. The other person, while he's not directly related to comic books, well, he is, but not as a comic book professional. In 1977, I used to give the tours at DC, and in 1977, someone new was hired in association with the company who had never read a comic book in his life and had never even seen an episode of the Superman TV show or a Superman cartoon. And I was assigned as his liaison to help him learn who Superman was and to bring him around and introduce him to the writers and editors, to Elliot Magnet, among others, and Marty Pasco. And we were both 25 years old, and his name was Christopher Reeve. And I think he did a pretty good job learning who Superman was. And I credit myself with being part of that process.
Good job.
Lenny, Louise, your face lit when I asked this question. You have somebody in mind?
Sure, John Sefrin. This is the reason I love John Sefrin. I fell in love with him at this point. I was
He reminded you of Walter.
no, this is years later. I was the editor of the books at this point, and sent him out a script with World War I story that took place in 1917, I think. He draws this beautiful story, it's like 8 or 10 pages, draws this gorgeous story, comes back to me, it's ready to go out, and I get this panicked telephone call from him. He said, I drew the uniforms wrong. I put 1918 uniforms on these people, and the story took place in 1917. You have to send it back so I can redo the uniforms. And I thought about it, and I said, what if we just change the caption? And he said, oh, okay. But, how can you not love a guy that wants to redo a job because he got the uniforms wrong?
I mean, I loved him, just loved him.
Well, you were one of my favorite editors to work for.
It takes a good editor to find a graceful way out of that.
Yes.
Well, it was easy, really, when you stop to think about,
When you were at Warren, they were paying $25 a story. And my page rate was well past that for anything. But you would call me up periodically and go, hi, you want to do a story for us? And I'd go, the page rate any better? And she'd go, no, it's still $25 a story. I said, you know, I love you, but I will not. And she'd go, okay, I understand. I guess I'll have to find some other person to write a story for John Severin. And I go, wait, what does it do? And she kept doing that. I'm like, Nino, I can't remember the people.
oh, yeah, I think I did ride with Nino, didn't I? Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And then she started, they found a bunch of foreign art, they think they're from Spain or somewhere, and she would challenge me. She would just call me up and go, I've got this really weird, interesting looking story. No idea what it's about. You want to write it? Right over the, I said, sure, because I love challenges. And she got so much work out of me for nothing.
For almost nothing.
Yeah, well, that was how it was back in the olden days.
Anyone else have a story about a remarkable person that never got a lot of attention? Anybody else have a story about another
I
remarkable
tried,
person?
and they've come and gone, so many.
Jim Warren was remarkable.
Oh, God, yes. Jim Warren was a fascinating
Jim
guy.
Warren was a character.
He was wonderful.
Tell us
I
a
know,
Jim
wasn't
Warren
it?
story.
Oh, God, there's so many of them.
My favorite is when he asked me to write a story for him, he had this great, very cool hipster apartment in the upper some side of New York. There are only two really, so it's one or the other. And he wanted me to write the story for him. I said, again, $25 a story, it's embarrassing. He said, well, listen, I was hanging out with Mary Screen and stuff, they're just friends. But he said to me, he said, I'll tell you what, write the story for me, I'll pay you the $25, and you and your girlfriend, who thought she was, you were an item, can have my apartment for the weekend. That was what it was like working with him.
I remember Jim Warren at an editorial meeting we had, and Marvel was starting the black and whites and making a really big push to push Warren out of the market. And I remember Jim calling us all into his office. And, Jim was playing with his own money. That was the big difference between Marvel and DC, which were owned by corporations, and Western, and even Archie, which was a family company. It was Jim's money. And Jim was considered a bit cutthroat at times. But Jim called us in and he said he was determined to outlast Marvel in the black and white market, and that he was prepared to go indefinitely, losing $5,000 per book because they made more than that on Captain Company.
Yes.
And in terms of and that they could keep going because of how much money came in for Captain Company. And talking about remarkable people, and I was trying to remember who, and yes, she got some attention, but when I worked at Warren, Captain Company was being run by Flo Steinberg, who had been Stan Lee's Girl Friday, of course, in the 60s.
Does everyone know the Captain Company was the mail order firm that had all the ads in the back, creepy and everything?
When you ordered monster masks or 8mm films or 30-foot in diameter Army surplus weather balloons, but Flo, when you talk about someone who could turn the world on with her smile, she was just bubbly. You couldn't not feel good. She just lifted the spirits of everyone around her. And she was just had such a magic, that was one of the real perks of working for Warren, was, especially if you were a male, she was just so cute and so vivacious. And obviously that was one of the things that held the Marvel bullpen together in the 60s.
This is an addition to that. When I discovered Marvel Comics, I was a sophomore in college in about 65. I didn't know at the time Marvel had lousy distribution. The college town I was in literally got about 10 copies of each Marvel comic. It was a big college town. If you didn't get to the spinner rack and buy the comic Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock when it came in, by Wednesday morning there was maybe 1 copy of Daredevil and 2 copies of Sergeant Fury's House and the others left, and that was it. I didn't know that. I stumbled across a comic, a Thor comic, during Mystery 120, Actually, I had two, I had 121, and at the end of 121, the absorbing man swings his ball and chain. Thor runs over to grab a small child who's about to get crushed, picks the child up, puts him down, the absorbing man blocks him and Thor in the back of the head and apparently kills him. I will say I had not read many comics at the time, so I didn't really know how this actually worked. And he's going, only one as strong as Thor could beat him, I've killed him, I win. And I was berserk, oh my God. So, I think this stuff was great. It was Jack Kirby, this is brilliant stuff. So, I went looking for the comic. I couldn't find 122 to save my life. I didn't know how to be there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a certain day, or that was it. And so finally, I wrote a letter to Marvel Comics. And the letter to Marvel Comics, which I fortunately did not have a copy of, was this obsequious, screaming, pleading letter. I read this guy, I loved this stuff, it was phenomenal. And there were no comic shops back then. There were maybe guys in their mother's basements with some comics they were selling. I didn't know that. I knew nothing about comics. I wrote Marvel Comics and said, I desperately need a copy of this. What happened? Can I buy one from you guys directly? So time goes by, and one day, a manila envelope shows up from New York City. And I open it up, and it's a copy of 122. And in it is a pre-printed blue cardstock piece of paper that says, Dear blank, all in print, kind of a handwriting print. Thanks for your letter, thanks for letting me hear from you, blah, 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 whatever. Signed with Stan and the gang. And then down at the bottom, it said, Dear Walt, it was penned in. At the bottom it said, Dear Walt, couldn't let you down, hope you enjoy the comic, Stan and the gang. I went, well, I can't say those words here, but I was very excited. I would probably put that somewhere. I was extremely excited. In my career, as much to do comics, as much to do that note and that comic as anything that happened to me, including all the artists' work I love. A gazillion years later, I'm in Marvel Comics, this time it's in the 80s sometime, and I have that comic, I still have the note. I take it to the office, I show it to Flo Steinberg, and she says, yeah, that's my writing. So I'm as much in comics from Flo Steinberg as I am from any of the artists whose work I love or any of the professionals I've worked with in my career. That's great. It was great, it was really good. That was the old days. I will say since then, not so much now, because I haven't snail mail anymore, I've sent out a lot of comics to kids who have written me and said I didn't find a copy of Thor 342, or I couldn't locate this or whatever. I sent a lot of comics for years on that, on the strength of that letter to me.
Time here, I'm going to take questions from the audience. Anybody want to ask anybody on the panel anything? You can go to the mic if you want to, or you can just shout out. Start there.
Yeah, there were obviously a lot of big shakeups in what you could do in comics at the time with like the drug stories and the death of Gwen Stacy. Did any of those impress you inside the industry at the time and say, hey, this is going to change things, this is going to make comics survival in 5 years?
I had lunch with Jerry Conway one day. And he's complaining about his boss, and he's complaining about his girlfriend, he's complaining about everything. I said, I want to hear this crap. What's going to happen in Spider-Man? And he says, well, I'm going to kill Gwen Stacy. I said, you can't kill Gwen Stacy. He says, sure I can. I'm writing the book, I can kill Gwen Stacy, I like Mary Jane. I said, everybody's going to hate you, everybody loves Gwen Stacy. He says, no, nobody will hate me, they'll blame the Green Goblin. And I said, well, everybody loves the Green Goblin, you can't kill Gwen Stacy. And he convinced me it was all right. It wasn't right. But I'd never gotten to understand Lois by that point. And I said, well, maybe I should kill off Lois. I was going to go into Julie's office and say, let's kill Lois and bring back Lana, because Lana has the red hair and Julie liked red hair. And I had a wet dream about Lois the previous night. So I never did it. I think I probably would have gotten fired just by suggesting that. So there you go.
I think the question was, did you ever say anything, if I'm not mistaken, that the story that you thought would change the death knell of comics?
Oh, that?
For business reasons.
No.
However, there was an implied question about sexual fantasies about the characters there. Clearly, he that was the subtext of what he was asking.
I don't know why
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir, next.
Hi, well, I actually had a question for Walt, but he
He'll be
left.
back. Yeah,
Don't worry about it. I'll change my question to you, Luis. It's a question about creation. I was going to ask him about his when he created Malekith and Curse for Thor, and how proud or sad he was that now it's in theaters, it's in movies, it's part of Thor, and he's not seeing a dime. Same thing with you with Apocalypse. You created Apocalypse. The character has become huge and enormous. He's going to be starring as the villain in the next X-Men movie. Are you proud of that creation? Are you kind of sad that it kind of went a different way after you created it and stuff like that?
Okay. First of all, we signed, we created those at a point mostly where Marvel does pay us a little royalties on stuff, so it's not like we get nothing. And Marvel occasionally, out of the goodness of their hearts, throws us a bone. A nice soupy, meaty soup bone if we're lucky, for creations that the things we've created that they use. About creating things, you make them up. I mean, they're just, and then you leave them, and they go off to have their own lives like your children do. And if you're lucky, they have good lives, but sometimes bad things happen to them. And you can't, you can't control it. You don't own them. So, you might feel a little reluctance when some things happen to characters that aren't things that you expected. But that's just how it works, because you've taken other people's characters and done terrible things to them. And we have.
Yes.
I mean, I ripped off Angel's wings, for Pete's sake.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So in that time, a lot of people happy with me, and some people mad at me. And so, I can't really complain. I know Walter feels the same way. You just, you try to create characters that have lives beyond what you do. And then you can't complain when they do. You're lucky. You've earned it,
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
I'm curious, you guys talked a great stories about people who were 20, 30 years older than you when you came into the business, right? And I'm someone, I came up on work that you all did, right? And how that influenced me. And now I'm 20 years into my career, right? And I see young kids coming up behind me and what they're doing. I'm curious looking the other way, right? People who come up behind you and what it's like for you to be 20 or 30 years into your career. Are there people who, to Mark's question, right, on the other side who, surprised you, who brought something interesting and were younger than you, right, coming up behind you?
Thanks, Morales. Good. Good stuff.
There's so much talent out there, and there's so many brilliant people who came up before us and after us. We're just part of a continuity. I mean, kids come in and they blow me away, and some of them can't even get work because all the chairs at the table are filled. And they're just,
I can hardly be more annoyed by Adam Hughes than I am right now.
well, there's
So,
Arthur, Bernie,
Yeah.
and those are back in the day. I mean, there's a lot of really brilliant kids out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hello. So many of the characters that you guys worked on, and I would argue shined under you guys, are now being made into feature films and they're appearing in television shows. Are there any of those types of adaptations that you feel really kind of captured some of those characters, or were there any that maybe you felt kind of missed the mark in a certain way? Which would you say kind of fell under both wings?
I was going to address it. I just say, for me, movies and TV are something else. They are their own thing, and this is not to say whether stuff's good or bad. I will say that, without talking about the movies themselves, one way or the other, I thought that the Thor movies, did a fabulous job of capturing the Loki-Thor relationship. I thought that was really where the heat in those movies was. I thought Tom Hiddleston and Chris Hemsworth did a phenomenal job. and I'm extremely amused. I'd like to rip some of mine. I would love to do that scene where you put the hammer on top of Loki and you couldn't
Oh,
get
me
that.
too.
How come I didn't think of that one?
Yeah, we all did. I had the same reaction.
I thought that was just that was an outstanding bit, but I thought, so there are times I think stuff's been done really well, which I'd rather talk about than stuff where I thought it wasn't. But I'm not as critical about that. I don't go into the movies as if I've got some comments I'm going to write on the internet about whether I like stuff or not. I don't plan to start any flame wars on this stuff, but I do think that they are their own thing, that they may take from comics, that they may be inspired by comics, but they are their own creation. Mark would know that much better than I would. And so I presume that means they would have their own dynamics and their own structure and things like that that would make you go in other directions to create that work.
And Len has Wolverine.
Among others, everything. I mean, when I teach writing, now and again, just at conventions or whatever, I always say, make sure you're writing for the media you're working in. You can't do a comic book story and then be indignant that they changed it for TV or for film. They have to. You're working in a different medium that has different demands and different abilities. Things you can do wonderfully, things that just, my favorite is, the line from the Daredevil movie where Bullseye says, I want a costume. They built the costume, the classic Frank Miller costume. They all loved it. And then they put it on him and said, Jesus, this looks stupid. And it did. It just didn't work in the real world as well as it worked on film. The whole thing about the leathers and the X-Men. You've got to be able to separate every medium, and my characters have been all television, cartoons, film. I've been overall blessed by the actors. I mean, Jesus, Morgan Freeman's Lucius Fox, Hugh Jackman's Wolverine is perfect. He's a foot taller than the characters in the comics. In fact, the first thing he ever said to me, he said, I'm sorry I'm so tall. I said, it's okay, I tell people you play him short. And it's true, he does. You don't realize how tall he is, he's 6'3". But it's about capturing the essence of the character in the various mediums. What can you bring of that character to the new medium? And overall, it's been done very well on all the movies. I mean, geez, all of the Marvel proper movies are amazingly on the money for who and what the characters are.
I mean, after all, if comic fans can't agree on what kind of character Wolverine is, what chance do movies have?
Yeah.
And we've all seen flame wars on the internet about that stuff. So you do what Len said, that's exactly I think how it works.
I read John Byrne's website sometime, and he has very strong opinions about the way a lot of his work.
I think about everything. I think. That's right.
Thank you.
Next up.